When we look into interstellar space, we're looking past other objects that are in our immediate environment that are where the light is transmitting or transiting through a vacuum. It may be, and thus parallax, by the way, is all about how light transits through various different media and what happens. So when light goes through water, it bends one way. When it goes through air, it bends another way. And when it goes through vacuum, it theoretically doesn't bend at all unless it hits something. And that's how they're trying to determine what's out where in space. But it may be that space, interstellar space, does not have the same characteristics that local space does. And it is easy to postulate that this is a requirement in the greater physics that we see around us. And we can postulate, because we've seen local comets go through dust and see their coma get very much larger and brighter, as we saw with the green comet that came in a while back and blew itself up, and everybody thought it might have been the blue star Kachina as it expanded because it got 300 times brighter and so on. Those kind of events happen in space due to local environment that the comet is encountering. I'm willing to postulate at this stage that there's a reasonable chance that that's also true of our sun, that the sun is going through an interstellar media that is different from the vacuum behind it. Now, I have a, as above, as below kind of analogy for you, and that is when you're in a sailboat and you're going along and just leaving the dock, any of the debris, any of the flotsam around you, little weeds or whatever, they hang behind your boat in this little vacuum in your wake. As soon as you get your speed going a lot faster, you can usually shed that debris because of the greater attraction of the oceans and so on. But that would be not the case in our environment, where the sun would never shed the debris. It would continue to drag us along in basically a vacuum environment that is local to the backside of the stars. And thus, I think parallax is erroneous. I think we cannot make a whole lot of assumptions about what we're seeing from far galaxies and star systems, because it may be traveling through a media that, in fact, it is traveling through a media that we cannot determine with 100% certainty that we know what it is. All we do know is that it transmits light.
Well, then I guess a follow-up would be a couple of things. One is the electromagnetic theory of the universe, and whether from WebBot data we can even really get an idea on what the nature of the universe is, from a physics point of view. What do you think about that?
I don't know that the data itself gives us enough evidence to really form a lot of conclusions about the way universe goes. The data you see is of a necessity coming through and is filtered and interpreted by and reinterpreted by human minds. Now, the mind is a nasty little critter, and the mind is so complex and so devious and so self-deceiving that it's my assumption, or always been my bias against standard psychotherapy, that you're basically using the tool to examine itself, and it'll never find itself. And so you'll never resolve anything with traditional psychotherapy using the mind to analyze itself. Now, in this case, I think that we are at that level where we have to say that the data does suggest, though, or while it doesn't explicitly state the universe is thus, it does suggest that there are certain people who are making strides in our environment, having altered their perception of reality. And by this, I mean there's been a lot of data about the new electrics. There's been data about the use of energy weapons and new forms of energy being used for material production and stuff, coming out in hints and leaks and so on. And I'm postulating here that those are all in reference to a new understanding of reality. And so we're at least a little bit closer. We're leaving behind the basically agrarian, pastoral, paternal overview of reality, and we're getting into the chaos, the really roiling, boiling stew of it all, and so we've got a better chance of figuring out something about it. But I wouldn't trust my data for that. I do have a much better understanding of reality than could ever be examined or ever be determined through examining our data.
And do you think the Russians that are typically of the view that the universe is electromagnetic?
Oh, certainly. That has actually been their statements for probably like the last 60 years. They're the electric model of the universe, and they've even gotten to the point where they're categorizing energies that, as far as I know, we're not even able to detect yet. In other words, there's a guy who's making a taxonomy or attempting to make a taxonomy of energies that exceed what the electromagnetic spectrum is currently defined as. Now, does he have a basis for doing so? I don't know. The fact I've sort of rooted around in some of his history, and he seems to be connected to what we would think of as the Russian black ops world. So maybe he indeed does.
Well, still, it's a fascinating topic. I think there's a lot of evidence for the electromagnetic theory as opposed to the gravitational thing, which seems to be kind of like medieval monks in Europe or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I personally am of the opinion that, everything is energy, and we're just have tricked our limited potential here into thinking that solidity actually is solid, that matter actually exists. And that being the case, if everything is energy, then it makes a lot of sense that as conscious beings playing around in materium, that we would structure materium to fool our energetic selves into producing matter, but that within that metaphor that we're playing in, within the sort of real video game we're playing in, the basic underlying structure of reality has to be mirrored. And so the perceptions we get within the material world, I believe, have analogs or are mirrors or small subsets of a larger fractal. So the fact that we have such huge cool things we can do with electricity here means that it is, if not a fundamental core precept of universe, it rides very close to that.
Sounds good.
We're speaking with Clif High from halfpasthuman.com. The latest SHAPE report, Things to Come, version 13, is now available. Okay, the next question is from Herm.
Clif, this is a sort of perennial existential question, but I think you've probably done a lot more thinking on it than I have. If the universe tends to balance, and at least in our little section of it, we could agree that it's pretty much out of balance. Would it be possible to say that perhaps the downfall of the minion class has the sort of momentum right now from the universe? And that, of course, raises the issue that if one believes that, then whatever choices anyone makes are in fact the right choices for this. And then, of course, that brings up that issue of determinism.
And karma and the whole thing, correct?
Yes,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. I've done a lot of thinking about it for decades now. I think that some of the conclusions I've come to have evidence to support them. I'm making general case assumptions from some specific cases that are the evidence, but so far some of my theories have held up to continuing testing and probing, and that's basically how I go along. I'll adopt a stance, I'll get a new idea, and I'll examine that idea, I'll twist it around, I'll chew on it, and see if I find it tasty and if it's pretty good. And if I think, oh, okay, it's got a chance of holding up here, like Dr. Bott's model, then I'll say, okay, well, we're going to adopt this idea and then fold it into our point of view and see how far we can go with it, see where it takes us there. So at this stage, my issue with determinism and the ability of humans to interact within the idea of a universe, as you say, existential, is there free will, is there determinism, along those kind of lines. And here's where it comes down to. It may be that within our minds, it is not pertinent as to whether or not we actually truly have free will. And as long as we have the conception and the illusion of free will and can never determine that we actually don't have free will, it doesn't matter. As long as we actually act on that, then we're acting within a set of constraints that are basically our operating universe. And now here's the issue. Say that you're designing a geodesic dome, and on that dome there's 1,000 interconnection, 1,000 hubs. And when a geodesic dome fails because it's been struck by a tree or something, the whole dome doesn't collapse the way a stick-built house would with a load across on beams on posts. Rather, what occurs is that a local region of the geodesic dome takes the hit and it instantly collapses, but then that it tends to shift some of the strain into the rest of the structure as a whole, and the whole structure reacts as a system. So, if human minds were receiving 5 billion inputs a day from our senses, which is the estimate, and our brains are decoding 5 billion inputs a day, but we're really only viewing or are consciously aware of 30 incidents in a day, and we're really only going to remember 1 or 2 of those incidents in our short-term memory, and maybe none of the incidents of any given particular day in our long-term memory, then I postulate that the issue of determinism is beyond our ability to definitively know, because determinism could be in the system as a whole reacting, and that system as a whole, because it's reacting in a particular way, and we are individual hubs within that giant geodesic dome, we cannot know if the dome as a whole is in a collapse situation, is going to have our particular hub try to push out or fall in. And because of the way in which the system as a whole will react, that individual hub will not know if it's falling in or out until the very last millisecond. And just may be that in that last millisecond, our conscious mind makes a decision that we then associate the falling in or the pushing out of ourselves as a hub with that decision. And it may not at all be directly related. Whether or not we go in and out as a result of this collapse may have been determined by where the system took the hit. Many hubs not directly related to us on the other side of the sphere, in fact, and we'll never know that. And we make a decision just a minute before we pop out into space, so to speak, and we think our decision caused that. Is that really the case? I think that it can't be determined, but we must necessarily act as though it is the case within our conscious mind, because Materiam is designed this way. Basically, I'm saying because all of humans think this way, this is a common characteristic of humans, can be extrapolated from any individual case, and it appears to apply to all humans. Therefore, if you are an aware observer and you're trying to navigate through all of this, one will say to themselves, at certain times, maybe it is better to take the third option. And a third option is what was described in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek series as there are always alternatives. And the third option really comes down to this. There is actually a third option in any given time relative to karma. And one of those options is always available to you, and that is to simply wait, to do nothing at that particular moment, which is not to say you're taking an inaction because you do it deliberately. And I have done this. I mean, I've actually gotten into situations where I've decided I will wait a half a second. I know how I want to react. I know what I think I will do, but I'm just going to wait and not actively do anything and see how events come out. And it was a very illustrative and very instructive bits of experiments to do, because I was able to see that at a certain level, determinism is going to carry on whether I make a decision or not in some of these instances, and thus brings up the issue of harmonizing. So I make this decision. I make these experiments up on the fly in the moment. Will that car go this way under these circumstances? Basically, who's going to swerve first in a game of chicken kind of thing with universe. And then I determine that, okay, hey, universe does things and events occur whether I participate or not. Now, the next phase, the next postulate to test is, what is the outcome if I actively obstruct universe by attempting to derail the experiment, or what is the alternatively, what is the outcome if I harmonize with it? And I've discovered that surprise exists with the latter, and determinism always leads to surety. So in other words, if I oppose universe, I can be absolutely certain that things are going to end badly. But if I harmonize with universe, I am always surprised at the new opportunities and the extra added value that pops up.